So we are going to talk about what we call conditional statements. So that's what we're going to fill into that first blank, a conditional statement. A conditional statement is a compound statement that consists of two parts. What did I just say we were going to talk about today that go together? In science, you make a hypothesis and a conclusion. So this compound statement consists of both a hypothesis and a conclusion. Okay, it's a conditional statement. It is a compound statement, two parts to it. The first part is going to be your hypothesis. The second part is going to be your conclusion. And these conditional statements are only false when our hypothesis is true, but our conclusion is false. Okay? So these conditional statements are only false when our hypothesis is true, but our conclusion is false. So far, so good. Conditional statement. That's what we're going to be dealing with a lot. It has a hypothesis and it has a conclusion. We call these conditional statements an if-then statement. Okay, if this happens, then this will happen. Okay, if this happens, then this will happen. This if-then statement is a conditional statement in the form of if P, then Q. Okay, what they use variables to represent part of it. P is my hypothesis. If this happens, if it rains outside, then Q would be my conclusion. I'm going to use an umbrella. Okay, that's a conditional statement. So far, so good. The hypothesis of the statement is the phrase that immediately follows the word, what does it say in bold there? If. Okay, so the hypothesis comes after if. So if it's raining outside, that would be my hypothesis. What do you think is the next one? Conclusion. The conclusion is the statement or phrase following the word what? Then. Okay. So if it rains outside is my hypothesis. Then I will use my umbrella. I will use my umbrella is my conclusion. Whatever comes after if is our hypothesis. Whatever comes after then is our conclusion. So far, so good? Then we have three other statements that we're going to deal with, and those will be towards the end of the notes, but we're going to talk about them now. The first one is the converse, and no, I'm not talking about shoes. Okay. The converse of my conditional statement is formed by taking the hypothesis and the conclusion and switching them around. So exchanging the hypothesis and the conclusion. So based off of what I said already for my if-then statement, if it rains outside, then I will use my umbrella. For my converse, I would switch those two and I would say, if I use my umbrella, then it's raining outside. Do you see how I just switched the two around? Okay, so the converse is simply switching the hypothesis and conclusion around. Then we have the inverse. And the inverse is formed by, yes, ma'am. Yes. The inverse is formed by negating both the hypothesis and the conclusion. What do I mean by negating? Stopping? Kind of. So if I negate something. So like if I say, if it is raining outside, to negate it would say, if it's not raining outside. So you just say the opposite. Yeah. So my inverse would say, if it's not raining outside, then I won't use my umbrella. Instead of is and will, is not and won't. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's formed by negating both the hypothesis and the conclusion. And then the third statement that we're going to deal with is called the contrapositive. Contrapositive. write that down before we keep going. CONTRASTIVE. Contra and then positive together. Okay, and this contrapositive is formed by switching or exchanging, like we said earlier, okay, where we took them and reversed them, and also negating the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, so let's look at, I want to just kind of take a look at it. You don't have to write this down, but I want to kind of show you what I'm talking about as far as these statements, because we will have to do this. We're actually going to do a little activity tomorrow where you have to put these statements together. So first is my conditional. If it rains, then I will use my umbrella. Okay. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to be given a conditional statement. And I'm going to ask you to underline the hypothesis once and the conclusion twice. Again, you don't have to write this down, but what would I underline once as my hypothesis?
English classes.
Okay. The stuff after if. So it rains is my hypothesis, right? And then my conclusion is the stuff after then. What would my conclusion be?
I will use my umbrella.
And I'm going to underline that twice. Okay, that's what we're going to be doing in our notes here in just a minute. Okay, so that's my hypothesis and that's my conclusion. And then the next thing I'm going to do is write my converse. So look back at your notes. What does it say we do with the converse? We form the converse by doing what to the hypothesis and the conclusion? Switching them. So I would say, if I use my umbrella, whoops, sometimes you have to like leave some words out and let it make sense. Then what?
It's raining.
It's raining. Can't spell. Sorry. Okay, so I just took my conclusion and put it first. I took my hypothesis and put it second. Make sense? Then we write our inverse. And what do your notes say that we do for the inverse? We do what with both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the original statement? Mm-hmm. We negate them, right? So we say if it is not raining, then what would I say? I will. Mm-hmm. Okay, then I will not use my umbrella. Mm-hmm. And then the last one that we will have to write is the contrapositive. What does it say we do with the contrapositive? We both, what's it say in this? Switch and negate. And we are all coming from here. So I want to switch these, but I also want to negate them. So I'm going to say, if I do not use my umbrella, then it is not raining. Okay. So yes, the stuff in this section is a lot of writing and a lot of words. So it seems like English class. Yes. Is everybody good? You'll get the hang of it once you do it more. First, I want you to just look at that first example. On A, B, C, and D, what I want you to do is I want you to underline the hypothesis once and then underline the conclusion twice. Okay, on A, B, C, and D on that first example, perfect. Underline the hypothesis once and the conclusion twice. The hypothesis comes after if, the conclusion comes after then. So you should be on your paper underlining the hypothesis once and the conclusion twice. Hypothesis once, conclusion twice. hypothesis once, conclusion twice on A, B, C, and D. Hypothesis comes directly after if, conclusion comes directly after then. So what would I underline once in A? A polygon has 6 sides, right? And then the conclusion that I underlined twice would say it is a hexagon. What I want you to notice, do you notice how I'm not underlining if and I'm not underlining then? Those are not part of the hypothesis and the conclusion.
Oh, don't do that.
It comes after if and after then. Now, am I going to count it wrong if you do that? No. Okay, but just know that it's an if-then statement. If the hypothesis, then the conclusion. So what about B? What would I underline once? The performance is sold out, yep. And then my conclusion would be?
Another.
There we go. See, this isn't real hard, is it? No. All right, what about C? What do I underline once?
Right, can we have a test on just this right here? Like this right here?
Just the underlining? No. But we will have a quiz on this stuff next week. Okay, if the forecast is rain is my hypothesis, I will take an umbrella, is my conclusion. The last digit of a number is 0 is my hypothesis. It is divisible by 10 is my conclusion. So if they're written in if-then form, it's easy. Here's my hypothesis, here's my conclusion. What the hard part is just remembering when we have to write these, okay? But we'll get to that in just a minute. What I want you to do is turn it over and look at the top part of your paper. So we have 2 statements here that are not written in if-then form, okay? So what we're going to first have to do is figure out the best way to write them in if-then form. If this happens, then this is possible. If this happens, then this is possible. So let's look at our first statement. It says 4 quarters can be exchanged for a $1 bill. And I want to turn that into an if-then statement. So what would I need to be able to get a $1 bill? 4 quarters. So maybe if I have 4 quarters, does that make sense? If I have 4 quarters, then I can do what? Then I can exchange for a $1 bill. Okay, so what would my hypothesis be then? I have 4 quarters, yep. And my conclusion? I can exchange it for a $1 bill. Does that make sense? So sometimes they will give you a statement, and it's not written in if-then form, and you will have to turn it there so that you can identify your hypothesis and conclusion. All right, second one, the sum of the measures of 2 supplementary angles is 180. Okay, the sum of 2 supplementary angles is 180. Let me ask you this, and this is how we have to think about it. What has to happen in order to have supplementary angles? But what specifically is the definition of supplementary angles? 2 angles like what? Add up to be 180. So in order to have supplementary angles, I must have 2 angles to add up to be 180. So if I'm going to turn this into an if-then statement, I'm going to say if the sum of 2 angles is 180 degrees, then the angles are what? Supplementary, yep. Question. In this one, what if I switched it? What if I said if 2 angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180 degrees? Would that be okay to write it like that as well? Yes. Yes, it would. Okay. Technically, this one can go either way. Some of them cannot, but this one can, because you can say if the angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180. Or you can say if the angles are sum is 180, then they are supplementary. So it really just depends on what the question is, on which ones can be reversed and which ones can't. Everybody good? Okay. Supplementary? It's right there in the question, S-U-P-P-L-E. Okay, so now we're getting ready to start practicing this. So look at your first example. What does that sentence say? If what? If it is Saturday, then there is no school. So the first thing we're going to start talking about is our truth values. So we're going to be given a conditional statement. That's what this is. If it is Saturday, then there is no school. What I want to say first, is that true or false? It's true. I mean, I'm like in trouble with not. There's no official school on Saturdays, right? So if it is Saturday, then there is no school. So that statement is true. So just circle your little T over there. Now, before we begin, looking back at our original conditional statement, what is my hypothesis? Let's underline it once. Hypothesis comes after it is Saturday. Okay, that's my hypothesis. And then we want to underline our conclusion twice. There is no school. Okay. Why are we underlining this? To help us when we rewrite our statements. So what I want you to do first is I want you to write converse next to your converse, where it says converse. Remember, converse is just taking that hypothesis and conclusion and switching them around. That's why we identified the hypothesis, we identified the conclusion, okay? So the converse is just taking the hypothesis and the conclusion and switching them. So what I want you to do is rewrite that statement and switch your hypothesis and your conclusion. We are writing the converse statement, switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. Once you write it, I want you to decide, is that statement true or false? So what would my converse say if what? Okay, so my converse should say, if there is no school, then it is Saturday. True or false? Could it not be Sunday? Or a holiday or something, right? So we would have to say that this one, whoops, is what? False. Is it okay that my statement and my converse don't match? Yes. Now what I want you to do is I want you to write the inverse. So go back to your original statement, and the inverse just negates the hypothesis and the conclusion. So you don't change the order of this one. Go back to that original statement, and you just negate it. So take a minute and write your inverse. Okay, we're going back to our original statement, the one that's typed up on the paper. And you're going to negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. So if it says something is, then to negate it would say is not. If it says something is not, then to negate it would be is. So what would the inverse say? If it what? If it is not Saturday, then there is school. Okay, so I just went back to the original statement and negated both of those. Is that true or false? That is also false, yes. All right, and lastly, I want you to write the contrapositive. That takes the original statement, switching and negating. Technically, it's just taking the inverse and switching it around. So the contrapositive takes the original statement, you switch the order and negate them. And then once you do that, decide if that's true or false. So what would that look like? If what? If there is school, then it is not Saturday. And what would you say about that one, true or false? That is true. So before we move on, looking at your statements and looking at whether we said they were true or false. We have 4 statements altogether. The first one is given to us. That's our conditional statement. Then we write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Which two have the same truth value? Okay, let me say that again. Which two are true? The conditional, the original one, and which one? Contrapositive. So if the conditional, your original statement is true, then your contrapositive is also true. If your conditional is false, then the contrapositive is always false. Okay, so these two have to match in their truth values. If one of them is true, the other one has to be true. If one of them is false, the other one has to be false. Which ones up there are false? Which other two match? The converse and the inverse. The two verses match, okay? So if one of them is true, the other one has to be true. If one of them is false, the other one is false. Do you think it's okay if all 4 statements are either true or false? Yeah, it is, okay? All of them can be true. All of them can be false. The important part to remember is because some of them are kind of hard to tell. So if you know one of them is which ones match up, then you can kind of go from there. These two will always match up. Your original statement, which is the conditional, will always match the contrapositive with its truth value. And the 2 inverses, or 2 verses will match together, converse and inverse. Is everybody okay with that? Okay. I want you to try the next example. Actually, skip that one. Go down to the last one. That one's a little bit easier for your second one to try. Write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive for that last example. We're just going to skip that middle one. Okay. Remember, the conditional statement is the one that's given to you. If the temperature is 25 degrees, then it is below freezing. That's your conditional statement. What I want you to do is write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Also deciding if those statements are true or false. On your quiz next week, you will be given a conditional statement. You will be asked to, first of all, identify the hypothesis and conclusion. Then you'll be asked if it's true or false. Then you'll be asked for the converse, and if it's true or false, the inverse, and if it's true or false, and the contrapositive, and whether that's true or false. And those will all count as separate questions on your quiz. So I can ask you a whole lot of questions on one line sentence. So you should be writing the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Decide if those are true and or false. If you need to, just look back at your notes and see what does what. It tells you how to write the farmer's numbers and conditionals. Tomorrow we will do an activity practicing this. It will be some extra credit, so it's probably good that we get to know what we do, which ones do what. Did you hear what I just said? What to do outside and cost extra credit. So what would my converse say? Well, first of all, let's scratch that. My original statement says if the temperature is 25 degrees, then it is below freezing. Is that true or false? That is true. Below freezing is below 32 degrees, okay? So what would my converse say? If it is below freezing, then it is 25 degrees. Is that true or false? Are there other temperatures below 32 that would be? So that would have to be false, yes. Just because it's below freezing, it could be in the negatives. It could be -10. That's below freezing. All right, so my inverse goes back to the original statement and negates it. So I would say if the temperature is what? Not 25 degrees. Then it is not below freezing. True or false? False. If you're not sure, you already said the converse was false, and those two have to match, right? So even if that one's kind of hard for me to tell, I can go back to what I said about the converse and say, okay, well, those have to have the same truth tables, so that's going to match. And then our contrapositive is taking the original statement, switching it and negating it. So it would say if it is not below freezing, then it is not 25 degrees. True or false? True. Again, if you're not sure, that one has to match the original statement.